Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first episode of our webinar series, NI Case Studies on Climate Action. You're all very welcome. Today's episode is all about creating a climate-conscious office, and we're here today with Danske Bank. I'm Géraldine Noé. I'm Head of Environment at Business in the Community, NI. And I'm very happy today to welcome with me as guest speakers Chris Martin, who's Head of Climate Risk and Strategy at Danske Bank, and Myles McCarthy, Director of Implementation and E-Mobility at the Carbon Trust. This webinar series, I forgot to say, is part of our Business Action on Climate, which is a campaign designed to challenge and support all organizations across Northern Ireland to address the climate emergency. So I'll give you a brief overview of what that is at the end. Just wanted to say that Danske Bank is one of our climate champions and sponsor of this campaign. So thank you, Chris, for being here with us today. And thank you, Myles, as well, for participating and giving us a bit of an expert view on the topic today. So for the agenda, we are here together for 45 minutes. So I hope you have a nice cup of tea with you. We'll start with the presentations from our guest speakers, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please do type them in the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And we can't hear you, so if you want to communicate with us, you also have the option to write something in the chat box. So hope everything is going to go well in terms of technical issues. And yes, that's it. So we'll just start with a very quick quiz with you all. This is not a test and there's nothing to win. This is just a bit of fun. So we'd just like to ask you to rank these 3 ways to communicate from the lightest footprint to the heaviest one. So which one is the lightest? Is it a long email, which takes 10 minutes to write and 3 minutes to read, written from a laptop and read on a laptop? Is it a letter written on a virgin paper and then sent to landfill? Or is it a text message? So if you choose, if you can vote, so 1 is the lightest, and the heaviest is and 3 is the heaviest carbon footprint. So for example, if I choose option 1, that means I think that the email is the lightest carbon footprint, then the letter, and then the text is the heaviest one. So I'll leave you some time to think about it. And I must say that's the whole carbon footprint, so that includes the computer, well, I mean, the embodied in the computer and in the phone. Okay, we have 68% of you who have voted. We'll leave you another 10 seconds to make your choice. Don't be scared, we won't be saying who has answered correctly and who hasn't. This is just a bit of fun. Okay, can we have a look at the answers, Claire? Oops, there you go. Okay, so 40% of you, so the majority said that the text is the lightest carbon footprint, then the email, then the letter. And that is the correct one. So to give you the numbers, the text message is 0.8 grams of CO2 equivalent. The long email is 17 grams, and the letter, so again, virgin paper sent to landfill at the end, is 350 grams. So 0.8, 17, and 350. So if you want to have more of these interesting stats, I urge you to read the book from Mike Burnley, How Bad Are Bananas? The Carbon Footprint of Everything. which is really thorough and really interesting. He has a dated version in 2020, so these figures are taken from this book. So congratulations to those of you who answered with the option number 4. Okay, so we'll now move on to our guest speakers. So we have, we'll start with Myles, so from the Carbon Trust, who will give us a bit of an overview on sustainability for office-based businesses. Myles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? You can hear me okay, Géraldine? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, you can hear me okay, great. Thanks very much for having me. If we can move to the first slide, please. And the next one. So first of all, I'd just like to briefly introduce who we are at Carbon Trust, and then move on to talk a little bit about sustainability as a whole for businesses. And then the second half to talk a little bit about opportunities in the office. So just very briefly, Carbon Trust, we are a mission-led organisation set up in 2001, funded originally by UK government to support UK business on decarbonising their activities. Today, we operate globally, 250 consultants, and we support a lot of businesses in the UK as well as around the world, providing advice for printing on environmental and sustainable impacts and innovation and new technology, all focused around sustainability and particularly around carbon and greenhouse gas levels. Next slide, please. And the next one. So just very briefly, apologies if I'm teaching you stuff here that you know very well, but just it's worth, I think, just remembering where we're heading and why we're heading. So the reasons for focus on sustainability and in particular around greenhouse gas emissions is the impacts that we recognise occurring from climate change, and you can see here some examples of those. A lot of discussion around what those impacts may be in the long term and how that may affect economies and people globally in the future. And we see real life examples, I think, more and more on the news. Only today we hear about record November nighttime temperatures in Australia as they're coming into their summer. Next slide, please. And just in terms of a little bit closer to home in terms of what we're talking about, we talk a lot about carbon and greenhouse gas reductions, and we do hear about companies setting science-based targets. These charts relate probably to Paris 2015 and give some indications around the language around the Paris COP and the importance of global economy to decarbonize. So this is looking at how the levels of carbon dioxide emissions over time for this century. And you can see uncontrolled significant warming globally, which is the gray bar. And then you can see more ambitious reductions, in particular 2 degree and 1.5 degrees. So that's the temperature change, average temperature change globally from due to climate change. And there's a big focus on recognition of the dramatic decarbonisation rates that need to happen to get to a level that allows us to limit the change to 2 and 1.5 degrees. And you can see there that levels are coming down quite significantly even by mid-century, which is only 30 years away. So if you hear companies or countries talking about net zero, talking about science-based targets, they're talking about targets and reduction trajectories for their country or for their company or for their value chain that follow these trajectories to meet, to limiting the temperature change. Next slide, please. And if we look closer to home in the UK, just to give us a good understanding of where greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, and you can see here that obviously generation of electricity is a significant part along with transport emissions. There is a bit of an interplay there as we move some transport to electrification, but businesses also represent a significant slice of the pie. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's driving businesses to take action other than recognizing the implications, well, there's a number of drivers that might impact on companies of any size today to look at their emissions and also to develop their own sustainability strategy and communicate that. We're seeing drivers from regulation and policy, and here in the UK, we've seen government setting legally binding carbon reduction targets and net zero emission ambitions, which will have a big impact on policies that impact businesses going forwards. We're seeing a lot of challenge from a number of stakeholder groups, consumers, if you're a consumer-focused business, or to your customers, if they're corporates, if you supply to a business that has perhaps a consumer focus. There's a lot more conversation and discussion along value chains of measures that can be done to reduce the impacts, not just from greenhouse gases, but more broadly, the impacts of products and services. And we're also seeing growth in investor challenge to organizations to ensure that they are recognizing the risks associated with climate change and addressing those, and also they are aware and thinking about opportunities, because a lot of companies have big opportunities as the economies change, and perhaps have technologies, products or services that can actually provide benefit or can benefit from that change. Next slide, please. And so the work we do with companies, just to give you a flavor of what companies typically are thinking about today, we are seeing companies a lot setting longer term targets, and as I mentioned earlier, science-based targets, so targets that actually are ambitious enough to demonstrate a level of commitment that will meet the requirements in terms of decarbonisation. We're seeing a lot of conversations along the value chain, so companies aren't just thinking about their own activities, but actually working upstream with their suppliers, or even thinking downstream about how their customers use their products or what demands they have of their products today or in the future. A lot of innovation for companies to think about, new technology coming through, clean energy supplies, maybe thinking about redesigning products to reduce the embedded carbon or the materials used or the in-use of their products to make them more efficient. And as I mentioned earlier, investors asking questions around risk and opportunity. Next slide, please. And here's an example of one of my clients, Carlsberg Group, one of the largest beer manufacturers in the world. And here you can see a graphic of the outputs from the work we do with them, looking at that value chain. And what's interesting here is a brewery is actually quite an energy-intensive industry. But you can see here that in terms of what they call their beer in hand footprint, so the the carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from delivering a bottle of beer to a consumer, actually only 14% occur. It comes from emissions, represents emissions from their breweries. There's an awful lot of upstream emissions, whether it be packaging 40% or agriculture 17%, as well as the malting process before they brew the beer. And looking downstream, there is the need to distribute the product and also to refrigerate the product before serving. So the end-to-end impact of a bottle of beer isn't just reflected by the activities within the brewery and within Carlsberg's own operations, but actually there's a lot more to consider. In fact, the majority sits outside of their operations. So just an example of illustrating how companies looking at that, but also how there's an important and in fact a focus really on the activities outside of their own operations, because that's where the biggest impacts are and the biggest opportunities may be. Next slide, please. And a little bit closer to home in terms of office-based companies, just a few examples very recently we're seeing of 3 large accountancy firms here. Sorry, the middle one, yeah, Deloitte, it does say. Just clip these from literally the last couple of months, and you can see here all setting ambitious targets, all talking about their value chain or the emissions across beyond just their own operations, their own offices and their own transport, and setting ambitious targets. And these types of companies, something like 85% of their greenhouse gas emissions will come from transport and almost all of it aviation. But also obviously the offices and the commuting are also important elements. But you can see here large office-based businesses, companies that are working globally, traveling globally, setting themselves really significant reduction goals for the next 10 years. And that will have a big impact on how businesses operate and how they go about delivering their services to their clients. And maybe 2020 has been an interesting experiment for us all to see how some of those changes can work and perhaps can be adopted more quickly than perhaps people envisaged in 2019. Next slide, please. And so just before we dive into offices, just thinking about the sorts of considerations that organizations of all sizes are thinking about today. As I mentioned, understanding impacts, and not just impacts within your own operations, but actually along your whole value chain, and then starting to think about a roadmap or activities that you can deliver to reduce that and to mitigate that emission. And target setting along those ambitious science-based trajectories. Big importance on energy efficiency, and we'll touch on that in a moment, but in energy efficiency, reducing the use of energy is hugely important, and the most important area. If you don't use it, you haven't got to worry about generating clean energy. But once you have improved your performance in terms of energy use, adopting cleaner sources of energy, in particular electricity, and we will see a growing use of electricity for current fossil fuel-based energy systems such as heating and transport. So there'll be a growth in electricity use even despite energy efficiency. So sourcing of cleaner energy, renewable energy, will be an important consideration for companies. And then moving through transport, heating, etc., to consider how you can further reduce your impacts and also communicate those to your stakeholders. So that's just a quick whistle-stop tour of what are the drivers today and what are the overall actions. I just want to spend the next 3 or 4 minutes just quickly looking at some of the opportunities within maybe the office environment. If we can move to the next slide, that companies will typically look at. So just briefly thinking about an office, based on data we've got, the biggest chunks of energy use and emissions from offices are in the heating, ventilation and cooling systems, the IT equipment and the lighting. There are other areas, but they're the key elements. So if we look firstly at lighting, next slide please. There's been a huge step forwards in efficiency of lighting with the introduction of LED. A lot of people have now implemented LED, but there's still a lot of opportunity for that technology. And today's products can deliver all and more of what's been required in lighting, and actually it gives an opportunity to not just improve on energy consumption, but actually improve the quality and the environment within the building to make it more functional. Next slide, please. And this one just shows you an interesting comparison of old technology versus new technology for a spotlight, and you can see total lifetime cost of replacement of the lamps as well as the electricity consumption could be 10 times less or 90% reduction, comparing the old technology to a new energy efficient equivalent, which is using only 5 watts of electricity. Next slide. In addition to using efficient lighting sources, also using both efficient but also practical and well-designed controls to make sure that lighting is used, artificial lighting is used appropriately, but also daylight is used where possible and where practical, because it's good for people's health and well-being, as well as obviously being free and zero impact on the environment. Next slide, please. And then looking at the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, heating can represent a significant part of the energy bill overall of an office, 20 to 40%, and there's quite a lot of saving that can typically be gained from improving the way that the heating system is designed, but also maintained and controlled. Next slide, please. And heating, along with ventilation, air conditioning, often come alongside, and in fact, over time, as gas and oil tend to be taken out of building design and electricity will become a bigger player, heating, ventilation, air conditioning will likely be a combined system that will use electricity as energy source and using heat pumps and refrigeration cycles as a way of generating heat, but also cooling down buildings where necessary. But again, it's important to, like the lighting, to always think about making sure that you're only using artificial conditioning when it's appropriate and when it's needed, and using natural ventilation and free cooling in building design or building operation where possible. Next slide, please. So very common situations that we see. Obviously, it's obvious, but making sure controls are properly set and used appropriately so that heating and ventilation, air conditioning is used only when the building is occupied. Next slide. And importantly, to look at temperature control, setting appropriate temperatures, making sure that thermostats are appropriately located and set, and perhaps limiting control over how they can be varied is important. Changing temperatures only small amounts can actually lead to quite a significant impact on energy use. Next slide, please. And between heating and cooling, it's often an area where you can get the two systems competing. So important to have a gap, a gap between how much you cool down to and how much you heat up to make sure you don't get the two systems competing and working through in an inefficient loop. Next slide, please. And here's a good example. You can see here energy demands on a weekly basis. You can see the 5 working weeks, but you can see actually overnight, before the changes have been made, quite a big demand through the night and also over the weekend. Whereas you can see then after the midpoint in dates, a significant reduction in all of those out of office times, which can lead to very significant cost savings, environmental impact savings, and doesn't actually cost very much, if any, money, if the right systems are available. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, I've got 1 minute, I think. We'll move on from this one, keep going. This is just talking about maintenance, importance of maintenance, importance of thinking about all the other equipment in the building, whether it's being used at the right times, timer controls, but also avoiding ad hoc heating systems that people may have to make sure the office is designed appropriately. And next slide. Importance to engage with your employees and find ways to involve them in the process. Next slide. And other sources available. We've got some publications on our website that go through this in a lot more detail and give you action plans. And finally, it's worth just thinking slightly broader than just the office itself. And an important area that's changing a lot at the moment is transport. Touched on it earlier with the accountancy firms, but thinking about how do you support your staff and also your guests to your properties to travel more sustainably, and that may require charging places for e-bikes or secure parking for bicycles and e-bikes, showers for people who want to cycle or run in, but also thinking about transport in particular with aviation reductions, perhaps people thinking more about using rail and other lower impact sources, and video conferencing. That was very much a whistle-stop tour to cover quite a bit. Happy to look forward to some questions later, perhaps, and I better hand over to the other speaker. I think I've probably taken 1 minute more than I was allowed, so sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Myles. I appreciate that it was a very quick tour. So we'll share the slides with all participants at the end. Sure. So if you want to have a look at more details, then that would be easier. And of course, we'll bring you back for the Q&A at the end. Thank you so much, Myles.
Thank you.
I leave the floor now to Chris from Danske Bank, who will give us a bit of a closer to home case study of what's happening here in Northern Ireland. Chris, don't worry. I won't cut you in 5 minutes, so you take your time, and we'll shorten the Q&A time.
Great, thanks, Géraldine, and good afternoon, and thanks to Géraldine and BITC for the invite to share a little bit about Danske's climate journey so far. So as most of you will know, we're Northern Ireland's largest retail bank. We operate across more than 40 branches. We've got a service centre, and we've got our head office building as well. And what I want to share with you today is just a little bit about how we started our climate journey, some of the things that have worked for us along the way, and also some of the areas in which we feel we still need to be developing further and building on. And I guess that's probably a really important point to make at the start of this session. We very much feel like we're on a journey here, and we don't consider ourselves to be experts or exemplars of how to approach climate change, and neither do we look at what we've done so far and think to ourselves, box ticked. We're really conscious that we're continuing learning, developing and challenging ourselves to be better in this area. And I guess that's the big challenge of approaching climate change. You can't expect it to be a one and done approach or solution. It needs to expect it to take time, require thought, effort and engagement. And I guess that's something we learned really early on in our journey, and something where I would suggest that a good starting point for climate ambition is really to think big but start small. So with that in mind, what did we do and how did we approach things? Well, as I was thinking about today's session and making some notes, I came across a really good article by Deloitte Insights, which really resonated with the approach that we have been taking. So with a bit of a nod to them, I'm going to talk about approaching climate change and sustainability through 3 different lenses. So if we could go on to the first slide, please. So firstly, the lens of looking in. So for us, obviously, the first step on our climate journey was to think about the type of business we were and the type of business we wanted to be. And that in itself prompts a range of questions, such as how can we play our part in addressing climate change? Do we understand our current carbon emissions? How can we challenge ourselves to reduce them? What short, medium and long-term steps can we take? And also what elements of our business can we change quickly? So obviously we're a service-oriented office-based business, so we don't have manufacturing operations to consider or supply chains to challenge. So the question became for us, what can we actually do and what impact can we actually have? Now, thankfully within our properties team, we have some colleagues who really grasped this challenge and set to work in answering some of these questions and coming up with plans to make changes. So our carbon emissions are clearly centered around our offices and branches, with energy use, heating, air conditioning in particular, as Myles just mentioned, contributing heavily towards our overall footprint. So our starting point was to think and plan how to address those particular issues, but also as an employer with around about 1,500 staff, we also had to consider our employee footprint across locations in particular areas such as our staff canteen, which had high volumes of single-use plastics and cups. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So over time, we implemented a number of changes, and as you can see, these range from the small and simple to the more invasive and costly, but all of which contribute to an overall ambition to address and answer those first questions that we asked ourselves. So at the small and simple end, we removed single-use plastic cutlery from our staff kitchens. We encouraged employees not to request single-use paper cups for their coffee. And to support this, we provided all our staff with their own reusable takeaway style coffee cups and also water bottles. We introduced recycling in all of our staff kitchens and set ourselves a target of reducing our overall waste to landfill down to 0%, which we're on the cusp of achieving. But what was really interesting for us was not just how our staff got on board with this, but also our suppliers. So as an example, our catering provider come up with the idea of bagging the used coffee grounds from our staff canteen and making them available to any staff who wanted to take them home and use them as compost for their vegetable or flower beds. So on the property side, we invested in replacing all lighting with ultra-low energy LED alternatives, and where possible, we've installed solar panels. And at present, we're working through a schedule of boiler replacements, so removing old oil boilers, and again, where possible, moving to heat recovery or air source solutions. But perhaps one of the biggest impact decisions we took, and interestingly, one of the simplest, was to move to a purely renewables-based energy supply, and that immediately reduced our market-based Scope 2 emissions to 0. So, as I mentioned, however, this is an area which needs constant review and attention, and the need to consistently challenge what else you can be doing in other areas of this business. So, in that regard, with effect from tomorrow, we're actually making changes to our company car scheme, which will mean that only cars with a CO2 of less than 75 grams, so effectively plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles, can be selected. And with effect from the 1st of January 2022, this will be reduced further so that only electric vehicles will be available under our car scheme. And that means we'll achieve our ambition of having a zero-emission car fleet by 2025. And so while that internal focus has been a core part of our climate journey, again, we learned really early on that there's only so much you can achieve on your own. And that's where, for me, the second lens, the act of looking around, comes into play. And again, if you don't mind, go on to the next slide, please. So as an organization, we've always focused on collaboration, being open to learning from others. In that regard, looking around is about uncovering best practices, learning from other organizations and individuals, and being open to partnering with other organizations with shared goals and objectives. So one of the first things we did in this area was to benchmark ourselves through the NI Environmental Benchmarking Survey. We committed to the Business and Biodiversity Charter and also challenged ourselves to achieve core accreditation. And building further on that in the last few weeks, we've signed the BITC Climate Pledge and committed to reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. So each of these schemes have forced us to look again at our approach, but also think differently about how, as an office-based organisation, we could contribute to making a difference. And in that respect, a key aspect and a key factor for us has been the engagement and enthusiasm of a number of our employees. And the best way to illustrate this is to tell you a story about one of our employees, Rosie. Now, I think Rosie's actually on this webinar, so I'm sort of taking my life in my hands here by sharing this, but hopefully she'll be gentle with me. Rosie is one of our operations team. She's really passionate about the environment, about climate change and biodiversity. And when she heard about some of the things we were doing as an organisation and some of the challenges we'd set ourselves in terms of the benchmarking survey and the Business Biodiversity Charter, she was really keen to get involved, but also to share her ideas about what we could do. So one of her first suggestions was to utilise an area of outdoor space at our operations centre in Dunmurry to create a wildflower garden. So in partnership with EcoSeeds, Lisburn Castlereagh Council, the Environment Agency, a number of colleagues who volunteered their time, and also a P7 class from a local primary school, Rosie went ahead, created a wildflower garden, and the primary school kids were able to spend time planting seeds and learn about the importance of climate change and biodiversity. And that initiative developed further as the wildflower garden matured, attracted increasing amounts of wildlife, with Rosie actually championing the installation of bird boxes and ultimately partnering with the RSPB to facilitate over 50 primary school kids taking part in the school's birdwatch. And the last couple of weeks, Rosie's been at it again, this time encouraging our colleagues to get involved with the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful, Healthy Oceans, Healthy Mind campaign, which aimed to raise awareness of the benefits of healthy marine environment and the connection to nature and being outdoors, and the benefits that can make to our physical and mental health and well-being, which I guess, as we can all recognise, is an area of increasing importance, particularly in the present situation. So she's one of a growing number of people who are passionate about the environment that they live in, but also want to see us as an employer doing our bit to support positive change. And for us, having the likes of Rosie has been a significant factor in the success of the various initiatives that we've developed. But what's equally important is that the message that sustainability is a core part of who we are comes clearly from the top of the organisation as well. So from our chief executive through our executive committee and right through our leadership at all levels in the organisation, there is a really clear purpose to take our responsibilities seriously, and as Kevin Kingston frequently articulates to those who know Kevin, that we need to be a force for good. So as an organisation, climate and environmental targets have been placed firmly in the centre of our ambitions and plans, reinforcing the importance of responding to environmental and climate challenges as a key part of what we do as an organisation. And I guess that marriage of purpose and people has been really key for us in developing and delivering on our climate journey so far. But as I said earlier, we're still very much in a journey, and while we've enjoyed some positive progress in relation to those lenses of looking in and looking around, we're very conscious that perhaps our biggest challenge is the one we're just starting out on, and that's the final lens of looking out. And if you just go on to the final slide, please. So we're going to consider how we can improve as a business by looking in, and how we can hopefully extend our influence by looking around. Then looking out is about how we engage and interact with our customers and support them in their own climate journeys. So from an emissions perspective, and due to the type of business that we are, our biggest emissions are those relating to Scope 3 and the emissions which result from customers whom we finance. Now, climate change is clearly becoming an increasingly important factor across regulatory, government, macroeconomic areas. And I'm sure you will all have seen increasing calls to build back better and build back greener as a response to the current challenges arising from the COVID pandemic. Now, with the UK government, it's recently announced its 10-point climate action plan. And while Northern Ireland continues to lag behind from a policy perspective, in recent weeks, we have seen a private member's bill presented to the Assembly, and other organisations such as the RSPB have put forward their own 5-point plan for a green recovery. But with Northern Ireland, broadly speaking, being an SME economy feeding into larger national and international supply chains, it is increasingly likely that business are going to be challenged about their approach to climate change by their customers and by their suppliers. And that in turn raises the question of what businesses need to do to start or further progress their transition journeys to a net zero carbon future, and also how banks and businesses can work together to achieve that transition, and ultimately ensure Northern Ireland flourishes in an increasingly low carbon economy. And that is an area which we will be doing a lot of work to develop and build on further as a priority for our ongoing climate journey. So I guess to wrap up, for us as an office-based service-centered organization, the process of looking in, looking around and developing a clearer vision from looking out has very much helped us to inform our journey, challenge our thinking and set clear objectives. Now, while there's no hard and fast rule as to how you would approach your own journey, and for someone, the call today, the sequence of those steps might look slightly different, but I do believe those steps are significant and have played a major part in our climate journey to date. And combined with a clear organizational purpose and the support of some really good people within each of your respective businesses, they're steps which can either start you on your journey or provide a catalyst to accelerate your next steps. So hopefully that's been of some help, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really interesting to understand what worked for you and the way you approach this. And thank you for mentioning all our initiatives at BITC. That's really well. That's great for us. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. We have a first question that's very timely and very relevant in this brave new world that we are living and working in. Maybe for Myles to start with, how do you account for the carbon impact of increased home working? Oh, you're on mute, Myles.
Brilliant. Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good question actually, and one that obviously is very relevant in 2020, but one that's been looked at in the past. And the answer is it's a bit of a varied situation. I mean, there's two parts to it. One is where do you draw the boundary of your emissions, and the second one is how do you evaluate what's the bigger impact, and whether working from home has a lower or larger impact. There is no right or wrong answer in terms of the boundary, although I think based on what I was talking about earlier, where companies are looking now very much at their the impact of them doing business, then where your employee works from, whether it be in a central office, in a remote office, or at home, fundamentally, by delivering your services or your products, that's part of the impact that you should at least be considering and thinking about how you can assist. The question in terms of is it a bigger impact or not, I think it very much will depend on the nature of how your employees are, where your employees are based, how much traveling they're doing, and obviously how much traveling they could be avoiding. And there is an element of trying to balance out if there is an additional energy use in the home, or whether they're simply using a space that's already heated and occupied. So it will depend on a case by case, but it's certainly something that can be evaluated, and obviously companies are looking at this quite a lot in terms of not just environmental impact, but actually what's the most appropriate way, most efficient way, and most how do you get the most benefit in terms of your employees and your outputs, in terms of how you design your working practices going forwards.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting one, and we all feel that certainly the emissions, I mean the carbon footprint from a company will be reduced, but everything is happening in the home, so it is a challenge.
Yeah.
We have a question for Chris. Is Danske Bank involved in any carbon offsetting schemes to offset the remainder of your CO2 emissions?
So at a group level, our emissions are rolled up to Danske Bank Group in the Nordics. So with all parts of the business in Norway and Sweden and United Kingdom here, and they're all rolled up at a group level. And at group level, there is offsetting done. So actually, at a group level, we look at ourselves as being carbon neutral because there are significant offsets ongoing. But we're looking at other ways to think about how we offset other elements of our emissions and how we might start to be a little bit more, I guess, specific. I don't want to say too much about that at the moment. We're working on a few things, but certainly at a group level, we are offsetting our emissions.
Okay, Thank you. I like the way the question was formulated, that it's the remainder of your CO2 emissions. So of course, the first step should be to reduce as much as you can and then offset what remains.
If I could just add a little bit on that, is it's a growing area for companies to look at and to consider, and it's something that's touching on a lot of communications and a lot of the targets that are being set. So there's certainly, as you say, prioritization around reducing and minimizing the impacts, and obviously considering the end-to-end impact of your value chain. In terms of offsetting, there's quite a broad church of approaches, and there's recognition that at the moment most of the opportunities are opportunities where you are supporting projects to avoiding further emissions. But there will come a time as we get closer to where we need to get to in terms of net zero, for example, where we need to remove any emissions that we have made in sectors. So there will be a growing focus on technologies and business models that can actually remove greenhouse gas removal technologies. And that could be reforestation or afforestation, creating forests and trees that can absorb and lock in emissions that we've created elsewhere. But there's also additional new technologies, direct air capture, for example, technologies looking at how they can actually remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and then sequester or lock them in. So that's going to be a growth industry and an area for investment going forwards. Example, Microsoft's recent paper talks a lot about their strategies around offsetting in the short term and then greenhouse gas removals in the mid to long term.
Well, thank you for this expert view on the topic, and I'm sure some really, exciting technology and investment opportunities coming in the future. Maybe I think we have time for one last question. So for this one is for Chris as well. Apart from the obvious benefits to the environment of reducing your carbon impact of your business, what are the other business benefits you have seen so far on your journey? Could be employee retention, cost reduction, maybe engagement with your clients as well. Is there anything in that field?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things there, and you actually touched on some of them as part of the question, Géraldine. I mean, I know, when I talked about the various initiatives we've taken, and some are low cost, easy implementable, and some are higher cost, but you have to then strike that balance between the capital investment and the long-term revenue benefits. And as Myles pointed out very clearly on his presentation, you start to look at some of those technologies, the upfront capital cost of them is very quickly offset by the long-term revenue benefits. And even simple things like changing to the ultra-low LED lights, they do have benefits in terms of your ongoing energy costs. So from a business perspective, yes, a number of steps that goes are really good for us. But the other bit has been, and I touched on it throughout the presentation, the engagement with our employees has been really excellent. It's really important for us that our employees feel very much like they are stakeholders in this journey, and that we're all in this together. And they have very actively got involved in this, which is brilliant. So definitely, I think the benefits go way beyond just simple bottom line. There's customer engagement, there's employee engagement, and there's stakeholder engagement, and all of those things are going to become increasingly important as more and more people face up to the climate challenge.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much, Chris and Myles. I'm going to wrap up, but thank you so much for being here with us today, and for your presentations. That was really insightful, and I love the fact that it was very action oriented and very practical. So thanks again for being here today. So just moving on to the next slide, I'm going to very, very quickly wrap up. So as I said, this webinar series is part of our Business Action on Climate campaign, so where we really want to invite all organizations across Northern Ireland to take action on the climate emergency. So what you can do in a very practical way is sign our Climate Action Pledge and commit to reducing your emissions by 30% or 50% by 2030. Visit our climate webpage, everything is in there. We have a new how to get started toolkit that's available in there as well, along with other various resources. So just go on the webpage and download everything you can. This is, hopefully you will find this useful. If anything we've talked about today is unclear or you have questions, please do get in touch. It's when we have those conversations with you that we can build something that is relevant to you around climate. So do get in touch with us. And we have 2 other webinars coming up every Monday in December as part of this series on NI case studies on climate. So we have the agri-food sector with ABP Food Group next Monday. Really excited about this one. And as well, industry with NSERC on the 14th of December. So this is going to be really interesting. We'll have those climate champions and some of their clients and partners along their supply chain. So very excited for this to happen. Thank you, everyone. That's the end of this webinar. You will be receiving the slides in a follow-up email. So thank you for being here with us today, and yeah, take action and come up, get in touch. Sorry, I had forgotten there was this poll at the end. If you can quickly answer and let us know where you are on your climate journey, where your organization is on your climate journey. So you measure your direct impacts, you measure your direct and indirect impacts, you measure your impacts and have set a target to reduce your emissions. You do all of the above and have implemented a strategy and some actions to reach that target, or you have not started yet. We will not be sharing the results of this. This is just more for our information, I would say. So take your time to vote, and thanks again, everyone, for attending today.